It's funny how often leaders who are ineffective get promoted to the top. And persecutors know this. They use it. It's a tactic, ensuring that the church never becomes a dynamic, welcoming, powerful place because it's led by people who can only paralyze it. And the irony is, they don't think they're paralyzing it. They think they're reviving it. Years ago, I had a contact in the Russian KGB, the dreaded secret service that terrorized millions of citizens of the USSR in the Cold War. And he told of how he was on a task force to ensure that the National Church of Russia, the Russian Orthodox Church, would be a compliant institution, incapable of revolution and resistance. Because it was the state church, the government controlled the appointments process. So they began, carefully, gradually, effectively, to place 3 types of people at the highest echelons of the church that they felt would guarantee its paralysis. The first type of person was simply a non-Christian, someone who had no feel for faith at all, no interest in it. A pure agent in place to report on everyone around him. And they would insert a person like this into a seminary and ensure that he rose to the top. It was a long-term strategy, but it worked quite well. The second type of person was the very elderly. You would think they would put young, effective, clever and compromised Christians in charge, but no, they were much smarter. They put very elderly Christian men in charge because due to their age, so the theory went, they would be resistant to change. And with them in charge, the church would never be responsive to society, never reform the church, never ensure dynamic priests would get promoted, and the church would just get more and more backward. And so it proved. The third type of person they appointed was the extremely incompetent. They might be nice, they might be well-intentioned, they might even have a strong faith, but they could be guaranteed to fail to lead the church effectively. And it was in this respect that I first heard the phrase, charisma without control. The KGB agent said, we looked for charismatic leaders full of gift and personality, but they saw their ministry in terms of exercising their own charisma rather than serving God. Well, in a few years, the Russian Orthodox Church leadership was stacked with non-believers, those resistant to faith, with the elderly, those resistant to change, and with the incompetent, those resistant to progress. And the result was that every time a great prophetic preaching priest emerged, like Father Gleb Yakunin or Dmitry Dudko, the church hierarchy was the first to persecute them, not the government. The government never needed to bother because they had promoted paralyzing people, and the church did the rest. There's an interesting coda to this, because when Gleb Yakunin was elected to the Russian state parliament after the fall of communism, he used his influence to ask for the KGB records to be declassified. And when they were, it was discovered that the patriarch, the head of the church himself, was actually a KGB plant. And for that act of exposure, Yakunin was excommunicated. It's a very subtle tactic. The persecutor seeks to enable people who will resist the will of God to be in power, and this ensures that the church cannot grow or the people thrive. It's one of the facts that must break God's heart, that many great leaders who want to change the church for the better end up finding the church their greatest enemy. History is littered with martyrs killed by a church leadership resistant to change, like William Tyndale, hounded to the scaffold by the leader of the Catholic Church in England, Sir Thomas More, and all for the crime of wanting ordinary people to read the Bible in English. Most of the great reformers ran the gauntlet from their own church leaderships. Luther was condemned by his own Catholic Church for pointing out abuses. John Wesley was ousted from the Anglican Church for preaching the open air. William Carey was kicked out of the Baptist Missionary Society because his concept of mission was too broad for their liking, because it included the education of the native population. And maybe this is why so many are put off Christianity today. They see how we hurt our own. And who would want to join a band of people that appear to shoot their own wounded? So our challenge is to notice how we do the same to our own churches. How do we promote people in our churches that actually end up paralyzing? One suggestion that a lot of people come up with, too often to be a coincidence, is what we might call the cult of the superstar pastor, who build their church around their own personalities. They have a fabulous church, thousands coming, but they're not building it around Christ, but themselves. And there are other ways we paralyze the church too, paralyzing messages like, let's just focus on evangelism, because that paralyzes the church, since it ignores the need for discipleship. There's no church more weak than one that adds new Christians to it, but keeps them immature because it doesn't take them deeper into the faith. Or there are paralyzing habits, like never eating together. This was the essence of fellowship in the early church. They got together for teaching and fellowship around a meal. And it's in that context you really get to know and love one another. Without the meal, there's a chance of remaining Sunday strangers. Or there are even paralyzing programs which keep everyone in the church running around and perpetually exhausted, so they've no energy left to just enjoy God. Let's face it, we're brilliant at paralyzing ourselves by promoting the wrong leaders or unhelpful habits or messages or programs. We may look great on the outside, but inside, we're suffocating. The good news, though, is that instead of promoting paralyzing people, we could promote empowering people. Because as we're seeing, the opposite of what kills the church revives it. So we have to ask what kind of people can be guaranteed to empower rather than paralyze. Years ago, I conducted some research on how people responded to preachers. And the interesting finding was that during the time a preacher spoke, his listeners were actually asking 4 questions that determined how well they would listen, how responsive they would be. And the 4 questions were, does the preacher have a real passion for God? Do they love others? Do they have a sense of weakness, which is the essence of humility? And is their talk full of God, as opposed to full of themselves or their own ideas? And these questions formed a useful checklist to ensure that empowering rather than paralyzing people are placed in leadership in the church. It's not a foolproof method, of course, but it does go a little way to ensuring that we become empowering people rather than paralyzing people. And maybe a way not to promote paralyzing people is to stop promoting people altogether. Maybe it's the hierarchical structure that produces paralyzing people. It's very important. God's placed the progress of the gospel into our hands, and we need to talk to the persecuted church to show us how we might be killing our churches without knowing it. Persecuted Christians say to us, the church is only persecuted because it's doing something right. And they always add, so make sure you are a church worth persecuting. That's another reason why we need them as much as they need us.